Hello, IO friends. Here is my presentation on selection and gender. It's a pretty wide content area, luckily tied to a concept that I love to study and that I find fascinating, diversity. So I've tried to gather some of the relevant topics, put it together in a way that does not require a particular depth into the diversity literature, and also looks at least some interesting findings that I was able to discover through a little bit of a lit review. So, without further delay, let's dive in. So, why should we even talk about gender when it has to do with selection? Why should organizations even care? So, as we've talked about previously in this class, when it comes to selection practices, one of the major considerations has to be, is that practice breaking the law somehow? And perhaps more importantly to an organization, is there some sort of financial penalty that could be incurred due to breaking that law? In regards to that, it's important to revisit, as we've talked about previously in this class, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1991. The 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination on the basis of a variety of classes, including sex. Now, I've framed this conversation in the form of gender and selection, and I do want to recognize that those are distinct concepts. And the EEOC looks at it from a gender identity as separate from sex perspective. But the actual Civil Rights Act only looks at it from a sex perspective, and thus certain organizations may fall into different buckets with this. Alongside the 1964 Civil Rights Act, I also want to highlight the 1991 Civil Rights Act, which basically expanded some of the judicial process components to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and essentially made it so that there was more money on the line for businesses that engage in discriminatory practices. So it is imperative that from a selection level, a potential sex argument can be avoided, and thus there are a lot of sex bias considerations and gender bias considerations that we need to look at and that have been studied in the IO literature previously. A concept that we'll revisit as we go through this presentation is essentially the idea that the cultural landscape around gender is a very turbulent one and has changed dramatically within the IO literature within the past few decades, if not just the past few years. So I wanted to start things off by talking a little bit about how things look today, just so you have an understanding of what progress there still is to be made with this. So, on screen I have a representation of women's relative representation within various levels of industry, comparing 2019 to 2015. So as you can see, there has been some improvement between these two samples, and women experience pretty good gender parity at the entry level, but they experience far less representation the further you move up in organization. And it's been noted that there's a similar breakdown in academia, with far more female PhD graduates and associate professors than full professors. So the fact that there is less of an evidence of women's representation at higher levels than there is for entry levels indicates some sort of broken rung, or what we'll discuss a little later, a glass ceiling. And there are a variety of explanatory mechanisms that can be offered for why this occurs, from potentially maternity discrimination, so women who choose to have children might experience worse outcomes because of the fact that they chose to have children, to just downstream effects of gender bias in education and the instilled ideas about their own ability having to do with math might affect women's choice in the opportunities that are available to them further down the line. So as I mentioned before, the glass ceiling is a concept that comes up a lot when we're talking about this idea of why do we see fewer women represented in higher levels of leadership? And so the glass ceiling is kind of a metaphorical barrier to women's entry into higher level positions due to a blockade, essentially, of prejudice and discrimination. With this prejudice and discrimination being explored through a variety of different theoretical bases. One of the fundamental ones is the idea of lack of fit and lack of fit theory introduced by Heilman in 1983. Essentially, women may not be seen as fitting into the idea of leadership. Women aren't seen as fit for leadership. And this can be industry dependent, with some industries being seen as fitting a female leader more, such as nursing, and other industries seen as fitting a female leader less, like IT. Along with this is the idea of think manager, think male, a paper by Shine et al. In 1996, which explored the idea that within the cultural consciousness, when we generally think of leaders, our stereotype is to think of them as men, and that it engenders a gender of man. More recent research has looked at the idea of role congruity theory, which is a lot like lack of fit in that it's trying to explore whether the role of leader is congruous with the gender role of being a woman. This was proposed by Eagly and Corral in 2002 and expanded on by Eagly and Carley in 2007 with the idea of a leadership labyrinth, that women are underrepresented at higher levels due to disadvantages throughout their careers. Think less of a glass ceiling and more like glass shards along the ladder as someone climbs it. Female job applicants in turn face a double bind. They're viewed as less competent, and competence being a major factor we'll look at as we explore gender, and less committed to their careers than men, but they're penalized for being assertive and achievement directed, in a way because of the fact that they're violating their gender norms. Alongside the glass ceiling, another concept that's come up a lot is the idea of the glass cliff. And this ties to that leadership labyrinth in that when women are promoted, there is a non-negligible tendency for them to be appointed to positions that are particularly risky and precarious. So it's much more likely that they'll fail, and thus fewer women will be able to continue climbing the ladder. Diving a little bit deeper into role congruity theory, I wanted to talk about the gender roles that form our stereotypes that we'll see explored throughout the gender literature, specifically agency and communality. Now, stereotypes generally come in two flavors. We have descriptive norms, which describe what a person should be like in a description sense. So men are typically described as they should be dominant and avoid weakness. And then we have prescriptive norms, sometimes called injunctive norms, which describe what a person should act like. And one example would be that women should help others and act in followership roles. Now, a blend of these concepts are agency versus communality. So agency is the blend of descriptive and prescriptive norms we typically ascribe to men, and it's a tendency towards being assertive, confident, and acting like a leader. Communality, on the other hand, is a tendency towards being affectionate, nurturing, and gentle, and is something we typically ascribe to women. Bet you can take a wild guess at which one is usually related to perceived competence. Now, an important thing to recognize, though, and an adage of feminism, is that sexism is the knife that cuts both ways. And so there are backlash effects if someone doesn't meet the gender roles that would be outwardly ascribed to them. So women who are agentic or self-promoting are disadvantaged compared to women who conform to their gender roles. They generally see more backlash for being agentic. In the same, there have been studies looking at gender atypical males, or males who are more other promoting than self-promoting, so more communal, and they're generally seen as lower in competence from a selection perspective and more likely to be passed up for a promotion or for a hiring decision. So generally within any diversity literature, it's a pretty vast field when it comes to the amount of context and interactions that you can explore. So I've chosen to focus in on a few when we're talking about gender and selection, specifically race, marital status, sexual orientation, attractiveness, industry type, and pre-existing female representation within the organization, just as some more common ones that I noted within the gender literature. But there are certainly more interactions that could be explored, like age, ethnicity, culture, etc. These are just the ones that we'll be talking about today. Beginning with race as a potential interacting variable when it comes to gender, you may have heard of the idea of there being an inequality Olympics that occurs with race and gender, such that people are constantly trying to figure out who has it worse, essentially. Do non-white people have it worse? Do women have it worse? And there is some evidence to support the idea that if you are in both a minority of race and of gender, you will have worse outcomes than someone who is at least in one of those minority groups rather than both. So, women who are non-white experience worse selection outcomes than white women when it comes to promotion or being offered employment in the first place. Now, this may depend on whether race or gender is more salient in a given hiring decision, considering that race has specific stereotypes associated with that. So, in a Rattan, Steele, and Ambati study in 2019, it was found that Asian women were preferred for an IT job when race was influenced to be more salient to the raters than gender. As well, because of the fact that there are certain ideas between dominance and race, as well as dominance and gender, this area sees some interesting relationships with gender norms, such that black female leaders actually experience less backlash for being dominant, or rather being agentic, than black males who traditionally have to fight against the stereotypes of black men being seen as aggressive, and white women who have to fight against the stereotypes of their gender role saying that they should be communal and gentle and non-dominant. Moving along to the idea of marital status. Marital status is a bit of an interesting one because of the fact that some states do have laws against the discrimination of individuals based on marital status, whereas others don't. So within gender roles, the idea is that women take care of the home, whereas men are supposed to be the breadwinners. And thus, partnership for a woman can cause employers to doubt women's dedication to the job, especially because being partnered is typically associated with the idea that a woman could get pregnant. Now, while pregnancy is something that is illegal to discriminate against based on a 1978 amendment to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it does not mean that women who could get pregnant, nor women who have had children, can't be discriminated against for those in particular. So here we see a parenthood bias, such that women are expected to value their family life more than their career, such that mothers usually see worse work outcomes, worse selection outcomes than fathers because of the fact that mothers should be taking care of their kids and fathers are expected to be out there making money for their families. Associated with this, men are usually benefited by them being married, whereas women are penalized for the reasons I just described. In an academic sample, employers were far more likely to weigh an applicant's marital status when the applicant was a woman rather than a man, such that women who were in a relationship were largely excluded from the hiring process in the presence of equally viable male or single female candidates, because the expectation was that in the case of a woman partner, or a person's woman partner, a woman is more likely to have a portable job. She won't be as dedicated to her career so that she can pick it up and move it to wherever the male partner is going, versus a female applicant with a male partner who the male is expected to be much more dedicated to his career, and thus his career's portability is conceived to be far less. Now, this marital status moderator might be context dependent, and there has been some cultural shifting that we've seen. Looking at the idea of gay and lesbian individuals and their marital status, a significant interaction was noted for sexual orientation and marital status for women, but not for men. So while there was no main effect for gender or sexual orientation in hiring decision, single lesbians were advantaged over partnered lesbians, while partnered straight women were advantaged over single counterparts. So there's a little bit of a upheaval within this literature that is somewhat important to look at, that now we do see more of an expectation that women are working just as much as men are. So it's a less robust effect against women, even though there are still some pieces of evidence of it throughout society. The effect of sexual orientation is something that's changed quite rapidly within the selection literature, such that studies from the early 2000s indicated a widespread preference against homosexual individuals, whereas nowadays there's less of a noted effect. There is some evidence that may say that lesbians are preferenced above gay men, but there's also evidence to suggest that sexual orientation doesn't have an effect on hiring decisions. In a sample that looked at first contact between employers from major cities, no preference was demonstrated between gay or straight men or women in hiring decisions. But there might be some evidence that this might actually depend on the gender of the person making the selection decision themselves. So, in a study looking at men who are making hiring decisions, they perceive gay and lesbian applicants as less hireable than straight applicants, whereas when women were making the hiring decisions, they perceived gay and lesbian applicants as more hireable than straight applicants. For women, this was found to be mediated by perceived competence and warmth, but for men, this was only mediated by perceived competence. One other thing that I just want to touch on while we talk about sexual orientation is the idea that its effect and the way that it looks for men versus women is very culturally dependent and might look different as you go from nation to nation and ethnic group to ethnic group. Attractiveness and gender is an interesting topic to talk about within the selection literature nowadays because of the prevalence of social media such as LinkedIn. It's entirely possible for an employer to make judgments about someone's attractiveness before they even talk to that person for the first time. This is also important to discuss because there's no specific civil rights legal recourse for discrimination based on personal appearance alone. Historically, this has been studied through the what is beautiful is good heuristic, as identified by Dion Burscheid and Walster in 1972. This is tied to the concept of a halo effect, or positive spillover to other judgments due to positivity about one specific domain, in this case, the domain being attractiveness, in that generally attractiveness increases hireability. Attractive individuals are perceived as more competent, qualified, and performing at a higher quality. Now, this may have specific interactions with gender in certain cases. So Luxon and Vanderveer in 2006 took an evolutionary approach looking at evolved preferences and found that in specifically jobs that were going to be hired with high contact intensity, or jobs in which the person making the employment decision was expecting to be in contact with the individual they were hiring fairly frequently, men relied on partner selection, whereas women relied on intersexual competition when making hiring decisions. And men preferenced attractive women, whereas women preferenced unattractive women. On the other hand, for attractive men, they were preferenced by both genders. The other side of this attractiveness research has looked at whether being attractive could potentially emphasize a woman's femininity and thus increase potential lack of fit. And this is identified as the beauty is beastly effect by Heilman and Saruwatari in 1979, in which beauty is detrimental to women in certain contexts. Paustian, Underdahl, and Walker in 2016 looked at this in male-type jobs, which they looked at as IT, versus female-type jobs, which their sample looked at as HR, and found that there was a gender interaction and a attractiveness moderator that affected suitability judgments, such that females who were more attractive had lower perceived agency and thus were less suitable for male-type jobs, and males who were attractive were seen as more agentic and thus more suitable for male-type jobs. And this effect was not demonstrated in female-type jobs, indicating that just for male-type jobs, this attractiveness moderator came into effect. When looking at the organizational literature having to do with gender, one typically identified distinction is whether an industry is more male-dominated or female-dominated. The Paustian, Underdahl, and Walker study that I just described used IT as a male-dominated industry, whereas nursing is usually identified as a female-dominated industry. When talking about the gender domination of an industry, one concept that comes up is the idea of tokenism, or the idea that an individual that is unique in some attribute, they are a token something brought to a context, will experience higher levels of visibility, contrast, and assimilation, as described by Cantor in 1977. And a token can occur in a lot of forms, such as being the token person of color or the token woman in an industry. Now, the gender interaction to this tokenism can occur in what's known as the glass elevator for men. So men who enter women-dominated organizations are sometimes favored due to the salience of their manness, as identified by Budig in 2002. So considering agenticism is generally a valued thing, men who have their agenticism emphasized will be able to move up in organization more easily than a woman. And the opposite effect occurs for women entering male-dominated organizations, in which their femininity and potentially communalism is emphasized, and thus they will experience the negative effects associated with that potentially. Now, some studies have identified that potentially overemphasizing incongruous features, as we've described previously, role congruity theory plays a large part into all of this gender research. So incongruous features in certain industries can disadvantage applicants. So masculinity in a nursing sample, when overemphasized, was actually found to disadvantage male applicants. And it has been noted that this may have some interaction with sexual orientation due to potential feminizing or masculinizing effects that having a certain sexual orientation could have on the person applying to a certain industry. One of the last ways I wanted to look at the gender and selection literature is the more dynamic approach of looking at already male-dominated industries that have women represented at their higher ranks. So one way that this has been looked at before is the idea of the queen bee phenomena, in which women at higher ranks of a male-dominated industry might disadvantage lower-ranked women due to gender self-distancing. In the discrimination literature, it's been noted that there's two common responses to discrimination. One being that individuals will identify more with privileged classes, and individuals will distance themselves from marginalized identities. So here, the belief is that women at higher ranks will act more masculine as an attempt to distance themselves from their femininity, and thus potentially disadvantage lower-ranked women who are identified more with their femininity. Now, there is questionable existence for this phenomena, as there are studies that have demonstrated that female leadership tends to increase female representation on all levels beneath them. In the Arvate, Galilea, and Todescott 2016 study, they were looking at publicly elected officials in Brazil, and they found no effect for female publicly elected officials on private organizations, though. So there may be a contextual approach that needs to be looked at in future research. Now, one explanation for the queen bee phenomena that gets a little bit away from the idea that the blame should be placed on women distancing themselves from femininity is the idea that potentially the reason that women represented at higher ranks in an organization might cause worse outcomes for lower ranked women is that female representation in upper leadership may have an effect on how much people in that organization are disturbed by general gender inequality in other domains. So in Georgiak and Rattan's 2019 study, they found that people perceived women's access to resources at all levels was overgeneralized based on the fact that there was female representation in top levels. And this is an important thing to talk about when we're looking at the idea of diversity research and especially gender research, because it tells us that perceptions of substantive social progress, or the idea that women can make it to the top, can somewhat inhibit the day-to-day work that needs to occur to combat inequality and make sure that more women have the opportunity to make it to the top, and other marginalized identities have the ability to be hired and promoted within an organization. Now, here's the part where if I could, I would be talking to you about gender in some conceptualization that isn't just men versus women. I don't know if it's out there, but at least not easily. I couldn't find anything about the idea of selection having to do with transgender and non-binary individuals. And that simply won't do in our modern age and our increasingly complicated view of what gender is in our society. Alongside this, it's pretty hard to find any conceptualizations of gendered traits, such as masculinity and femininity, that are seen as continuous, which is fairly important in our idea of gender identity nowadays, rather than simply being categorical and saying that you have masculine men and masculine women, or feminine women and feminine men. So this is one thing that I think the literature needs to approach. As gender fluidity is becoming much more common, and thus individuals in the workplace might not necessarily identify as men or women, and thus a lot of what I've talked about is potentially utterly inapplicable to those situations. To emphasize the fact that this is something that'll be more important as time goes on, generationally, it's been demonstrated by the Pew Research Center that Gen Z is more familiar and more comfortable with the idea of gender neutrality. So this is something that I hope to see in the literature in the future when it comes to the idea of gender research, and it's a future direction that I think the field needs to approach to better encompass the type of worker that we'll be seeing in the future. But for now, this is just a soapbox I'm standing on, telling you about as I tried to look at this literature. And that's it. Thank you for sitting through this presentation. I hope you have at least gotten something out of it that you didn't otherwise know, and this has deepened your understanding of gender as it applies to selection. If you do have any questions, you know me, ask me somehow. I am happy to hear any reactions you might have had, along with help you potentially answer any lingering questions. So I hope you've enjoyed, and this is me signing off.